So welcome back, everyone. Very excited for this session, which is on science, spirituality, and the awareness to action approach. With me is my good friend Vibha Gosselin, who I will read her bio here, but Vibha is coming to us from Normandy, France, where she lives. So it's great to be with you here, Vibha. I've been looking forward to this session. Vibha was a student of Sri Aurobindo ashram from the ages of 7 to the age of 20. She lived in India, and that's where she attended the ashram. Her most formative years were spent in a school that followed the principles of integral education, a radically new system where students don't pass or fail and that does not deliver certificates. She grew up absorbing the values of projects like Auroville, a UNESCO-supported township dedicated to human unity. After her studies, she was asked to be in charge. She was asked to be in charge of the community dining hall team, learning to apply the yogic attitude to management. When she left the ashram, she turned to education, working as a high school teacher and a trainer for teachers in integral education. She moved to France at the age of 31, went back to school to get a university degree there, graduated in sociology from the Sorbonne, worked as a co-coordinator and trainer at a vocational training center. The Enneagram came into Vibha's life in 2004. She's certified in the narrative tradition. She contributed to the growth of IEA France as a founding member, developed and co-facilitated a self-awareness and relationships program for Airbus, is a guide and faculty member of the Enneagram Prison Project and an associate of Awareness to Action in France. She lives in Normandy with her husband, David, and 2 teenage boys, enjoys spending time with family and friends, traveling to retreats in the Gurdjieff work, and continuing to explore ways to bring East and West together within herself through conversations. All right, so Vibha, it's great to be with you here today.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Mario.
Good. But Vibha and I have had lots of conversations on this topic over the years, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that with you. Vibha is going to be the star of this show, and I'm just going to ask questions and comment here and there. Okay, so Vibha has lots of comments that she's going to bring to us. As always, there's chat place where you can make comments or questions as we go. So we encourage you to do that. And again, just our hourly or so pitch for the certification program, which starts next week. See awareness-to-action.com for more information on the online certification program. Let's see. All right, so we are talking about awareness to action, spirituality, and science. This is a topic that's of great interest to me. I've written on this, I've talked on this at conferences, that sort of thing. I mentioned earlier that when we talked about awareness, that spirituality is one of those words that means different things to different people. Typically, we don't emphasize spirituality in the awareness to action programs, primarily because we work in organizations a lot of the times. And I just don't think it's appropriate to really bring spirituality into that conversation unless the client requests that we do so, and even then on just a one-to-one level from my approach. There are also some legal issues and HR issues on talking about spirituality in organizations. So we don't talk about it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't infuse everything that we do. I'm a big believer in what Khalil Gibran wrote in The Prophet, when the people in the village asked the prophet, "Speak to us this day of religion," and he said, have I spoke of aught else, right? Meaning that, everything, religion or spirituality permeates everything that we do, whether we talk about it or not. So this is an opportunity for us to talk about it. So I'm very interested, Vibha. Vibha, anything we need to be clear on before we get going?
No, that's fine. I just was curious about knowing where people are coming from.
Yeah, so maybe people could write into the chat room, the chat box, where you're from right now. Where are you sitting as you're listening or observing this? It would be very interesting to know. Okay. So take a second, write us a chat if you don't mind. Okay. While people are doing that, Vibha, I'm going to ask you.
Yes, sure.
I'm going to ask you.
Sure, South Africa's. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you my first question, which is, not really a simple one, but first question is, what is spirituality? I think that when we talk about this, we should always define what we're talking about. So,
right.
What does spirituality mean to you?
So, whenever I have to define something, for me, the impulse is to go back to Sanskrit, because that was my passion at school. And so in Sanskrit, the word spirituality as such is easier to understand if you turn it into an adjective, that you live a spiritual life or you live an ordinary life, but there is no judgment about what is good or what is bad. It's a definition. So typically it would mean under the guidance of or alongside spirit, the literal meaning of that. But just like you said, when you said that one of in India, what's very closely associated to it is that it's not what you do, but the attitude in which you do something. So that's where I would begin.
So what would you say is a spiritual attitude then? Or how, when you say that it's the attitude with which you do something, say more about that.
Yes. So, I'm reverting to the Indian context, because that's my culture and that's where I grew up. And so of course, there is, when we speak about spirit, it seems like a word that is so abstract. What it means to us in the Indian context is that there is only that, and it has different forms. So there is consciousness, it has different forms in the manifested world. So that's one way to look at it. And so the attitude in which you do something means that keeping in mind that whatever I am doing, it's not because I'm praying that I become spiritual. It's not that. If I pray in an automatic way, without, like you were speaking about the mindful, without putting my attention to my prayer, it's like a form without any spirit in it. So that's
okay. Good. So so it's interesting again to that helps to, let's see, what do I want to say here? The very often words like this can be so challenging because everything you said there I can feel, right? But I can't define. I can't describe.
Right. Yes.
So
yes.
When I listen to you, I think, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me, and I get that, but I can't describe it or define it.
Yes, that's the thing about if I would say, of course, I would like you to define science in the same, because this is a conversation. And so the thing about the spirit, you know, I'm using the word spirit because I'm speaking in English.
Yeah.
So this, if you put it in the spiritual context, like, because we are in a world that is threefold, there is something you can know about it, there is something that is not known, and there is an unknowable part of it. See, so it is hard to define because it is an experience,
right?
And you experience it because you are in a body and you have a heart and you have a mind. You experience it in all parts of yourself, and you experience it in relationship too. And you get an experience of it, and why, you know, of course, then we come to experience. How do you know that the experience you're having is spiritual or not? You know?
Yeah.
So that's the other part of it, which is very tricky, because leading a spiritual life, one of the metaphors given in India is like, you know, you're like a tightrope walker, but you are walking on a razor's edge. So your instruments leading a spiritual life is like your instruments need to be unbiased. You know, that's where I feel science and spirituality meet, because we're trying to bring some objectivity into what we are experiencing and how we read that. And that's a long process.
Right.
So it's something I can aspire for, because there is an urge in man to progress. And when we see evolution from the, let's say, in the Indian context, which gives a spiritual reading of evolution, is that it's because
Maria Jose,
okay.
Maria Jose, you have to mute.
So it's because
sorry about that.
It's because that, you know, we don't even call it a spirit. You know, one of our famous mantras or formulas is "I am that." It's not even, you know, there's no word to it, so that we can't interpret it.
Right.
So that, because that involved into matter, that matter can evolve. So you can't have evolution if there is no involution, in that sense.
No.
So we have life forms, this out of immobile matter, we have life forms emerging. Out of life, we have the mind form emerging. And why should we consider mind as the last form of evolution? There could be something beyond mind. And so there is an urge to progress, and this urge to progress is what is defined as the aspiration of man, and that's where I begin with, an aspiration for something.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about Indian philosophy, as you're describing it, is that unnamableness of things. When you mention "I am that," I think of Nisargadatta's book "I Am That," which is, you know, one of my favorites in that area. And so for me, because you asked me about defining science, right? And I always try to think about these things in terms of epistemology. Right? Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that explores the nature of knowledge, how we know what we know, and so forth. So in epistemology, there's a distinction between objective facts and knowledge of those objective facts and subjective experience. And the two things are different qualities, different aspects, different ways of experiencing the world. And we make a mistake when we conflate the two. So when I think about what science is, you know, it's tricky because, you know, there's a whole branch of the philosophy of science devoted to what's called the demarcation problem, right? Which is, how do we know when we're into science and when we're not, right? How do we know when we're practicing science or when we're practicing pseudoscience, okay? And this is tricky, right? So there's no clear-cut definition, right? There are many definitions, but none of them are completely satisfactory. So we always have to keep that in mind, that these things exist on a continuum of objectivity and subjectivity. Okay? And the key to growth in a spiritual or psychological way is to understand when we are into which category, right? With the recognition that sometimes we're not quite sure, okay? Could be this, could be that,
Yes.
but at least we have to admit it. Okay?
Yes.
So for me, science, I wrote down something here, and now I can't read my my handwriting, but it's systematic knowledge of the physical or material ground through observation and experimentation. Okay? It deals with objective matters. It doesn't deal with subjective matters. Now, we can use science to identify what's happening inside of me when I am playing with my children. Okay, they can measure the hormone releases and, you know, whatever else happens, right? But to me, when I'm playing with my children, science is irrelevant. Okay, when it comes to whether I love my children or not, science doesn't matter. Okay, again, you can measure the physical phenomenon, but you can't measure the philosophers would call it the qualia, right? The experience of a thing, right? So science is around those things which we can objectively measure, right? It's also important to remember that science has rules to it, right? There are, you know, you can't just change the rules of science to fit something that you want to call scientific, right? But really isn't. Okay, this is one of my pet peeves with a lot of people who try to apply science to spirituality. Okay, I think they complement each other, but I don't think we can blend them necessarily, right? Because they both have their domains. It's like trying to blend left and right. Okay, it's like, okay, I'm not quite sure where left becomes left and right becomes right, but I have a good sense of it, right? And I shouldn't confuse the two. So for me, science is about dealing with objective things. And by objective, I mean things that are true, whether I like it or not. Right? And it's something that would be true whether anybody was really, you know, observing it or not, or experiencing it or not. The moon is there whether anybody sees it or not from a scientific perspective. Okay? So science is about what we can know objectively, how we can determine it by rules. The other thing that's important to know about science is that it's primarily rooted in falsification, right? Meaning when we practice the scientific method, we observe phenomena, we see what's happening around us, and then we create a hypothesis. I think if I push here, I'll get this reaction over there. And then we create an experiment. We'll test it, okay? But the key thing is that I want to try and prove my hypothesis to be flawed, to be false, to not work. And that's how I learn. That's how I grow, is by continued attempts to falsify facts, okay? Falsify my experiments. And a good scientist will tell you we never really know anything for sure. And if anybody tells you something is scientifically proven, they're not a scientist, because scientists say that we have this degree of probability that this will happen. Okay, so when I come to this topic, there are different epistemic tasks. Right? Some epistemic tasks are subjective, and I would put, I guess, spiritual into that category, or, you know, call that category spiritual perhaps. And then there are things that are objective, that is the domain of science. Okay. And I'm perfectly fine. I'm perfectly fine with not being able to define what that is when you say I am that, right? But I don't need to. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Good. So we were going to do an exercise of asking people how they integrate science and spirituality. Is there anything you'd like to say on this before we do that exercise?
Yes, why I wanted people to do this exercise is that we all have some notion in ourselves of what we think as science and what we think as spirituality. And it's interesting to see, and we all also have, because the world has become such that East needs to meet West and we need to work together. It's the same in these spheres, is how do we go about it in our lives, you know? What place does science have and how am I using it? Or what place does spirituality have? Or how am I using it? It could be whatever. If I'm more leaning towards one or more leaning towards the other, just to know how we situate ourselves around these topics.
Yeah. Great. Great. All right. So with that in mind, so the question here for the exercise is, how do you integrate both in your life, right? Science and spirituality. So Maria Jose, I'm going to ask you to put people into breakout rooms. And why don't we take 10 minutes for this exercise, okay?
Okay.
All right. So why don't we see what people had to say? I'd be very curious. So if you would like to share what you came up with during the breakout session, we'd love to hear from you. So Maria Jose, I don't know, is there a way for people to raise their hands or something? I don't know how any of this stuff works.
Yes, you can raise your hands on the participants box or write it on the chat box.
Great.
So there's a comment from Alicia Boy. Alicia, do you want to comment out loud? Share with us?
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So we were from 3 different countries, as you can see. So Italy, Spain, Switzerland, El Cairo, and we were saying how often depends on the situation and which state of mind you have in that specific moment. So you use more one approach or the other. And also how culture influences a lot, how we see a specific approach to that moment. So if you are more spiritual or scientific in that specific situation.
Interesting. Yeah, great. Great. And that's exactly how it should be, right? What is the tool for the situation is how we want to think about that. Great. Thank you, Alicia.
You're welcome.
All right. So
Becky Gorman. Yes. Becky Gorman, raise your hand.
All
Becky.
right.
Yes, hi.
Becky.
Well, based on our conversation, something popped up that I haven't said for a while to folks, but it seemed fitting. And when I was teaching, I directed a course for 10 years for medical students on basically the humanness dimension of their practice. And of course, their first year students are immersed in science. There's so much absorption and detail and beyond what you can even possibly remember. But there's an excitement about that. People love getting into that if you're in school. But this course was all about the human dimension. And so one of the evenings of our course, it went on for several months, but they had to do it in the evening after hours, was on mystery and awe. And this is where, for me, science and spirituality overlap very well. because we don't have the answers. And I loved teaching that evening because what we would talk about is that we don't really know, and we can't know how people get well or get ill. We don't have the answer. There's a certain mystery in medicine that you have to include. And the mind doesn't want to do that. The mind wants to nail it down. And we think that certain things we did, we really created the healing. But we can't prove that. And so I loved helping them, and it was hard for them because that's not the stage that they were in, but they also loved it. So there is a place where I believe it's the easy place to sink into for me. I love mystery, and I would always say there's certain things we will never be able to prove. And that's a good thing. And we want to, I like the fact that there are things that I just need to have faith in or have the question with no ability to answer.
Good. Vibha, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, the question reminded me, one of my teachers in the Fourth Way tradition, Anthony Blake, a student of Mr. Bennett's, he keeps insisting on this question. He says, what's your burning question? Be that question, and, eat that question and live that question. So there's something around the questioning also, which is similar to both approaches.
Yeah. Like Becky, you said something too, that there are some things you just have to take on faith. And whenever I talk about this, I like to bring up the debate between Anselm and Occam in the Middle Ages about the nature of God, right? And Saint Anselm had written the ontological argument, which was all about proving the existence of God from a logical perspective, right? And it's it's a classic argument, but it's also flawed philosophically. And Occam, who was also a believer, said, "Look, this is the wrong approach to it, right? You can't argue that God exists or doesn't exist. You can just feel it, right? It's something that one takes on faith or one does not. One either has that faith or one does not." And so even with something like that, there are these things that, again, are in the unknowable, and we just make some decision rooted in some feeling we have about how we want to approach that topic. But again, for me, the key difference is knowing when those questions are unanswerable and when they are, right? I mean, there are some questions that are answerable, but they fall into the domain of science, okay? So, all right.
So Mario and Vibha, there's a group that apparently had a very interesting conversation.
Sure.
For Maria and Gordon Saladino, and
Okay.
I think they might have something to share.
Sure, let's hear it.
Because Maria is encouraging Gordon Saladino to talk. So Gordon, we're waiting for you.
Yeah. Gordon, go ahead. Your spotlight's on you, pal.
You're on mute. You're muted. Oh. Gordon,
Gordon, we can't hear you. You have to unmute. Great.
I am so sorry. Here I was chatting away.
Okay.
We missed all the good stuff, huh, Gordon?
No, I was just going to say, okay, I'm willing to share. And suggested two possible approaches, and I tend to oscillate between them over time based on my circumstances. But the first is choosing one of the two as a framework within which to understand the other. So if I choose spirituality as my framework, I use that as a context within which to understand the scientific basis for whatever I might be facing or needing to work through in any given moment. And if I need to, and if it's helpful, I switch that around and I look at spirituality from within a framework of scientific understanding, and then see how that might change my point of view, my understanding, or things that I can see now that I wasn't able to see or understand earlier.
Yeah.
And so I basically switch perceptual positions in order to get a larger field of understanding.
Hmm.
The other approach was that I will often use spirituality to determine the what I should be doing, or the big why, and then scientific method to determine how to go about achieving that end result.
Right.
And I cited the whole concept of the smallest next step, which is essentially stopping periodically to take my bearings and to make course corrections. Given that most navigators tell us that when they're on a journey, whether they're piloting a plane or a ship, they're off course like 90% of the time. And if you were to chart their course from above, it would look like this zigzag, right? As they move toward and reach their destination. And as it turns out, if you make smaller, more frequent adjustments, you'll actually get there faster. Because if you have to make larger, less frequent adjustments, you're off course more often, and it will therefore take you longer, and it will be more expensive to reach your destination.
Yeah, it's
So
great.
those were my 2 thoughts on integration.
Great. Thanks, Gordon. Appreciate that.
Welcome.
Yeah. Good. It made me think of, there was a great essay that the Dalai Lama wrote in the New York Times some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, called Our Faith in Science. And what he was saying is that science is important. He's always been very interested in science, and always, had a curiosity about science. And what he was suggesting is that we have to recognize that when science contradicts some belief that we have to change our beliefs, right? He said that people often ask me, what if science disproved or proved something I believe in my Buddhist practice? And the Dalai Lama would say, well, then Buddhism needs to change, right? Because in that topic. But at the same time, scientists need to have more humility and open themselves up to spiritual concepts, not necessarily metaphysical concepts, but about how to be more human, like Becky was talking about, like Gordon was talking about. These questions of meaning and purpose is the domain of spirituality. So, yeah. All right.
It was a very similar sentence I read with my own teacher when she was doing through her spiritual practices, and spirituality has very clear method in different traditions. And that's one thing in today's world, anything and everything which is not scientific can tend to be called spiritual in a way,
Right.
but it's more like what you mentioned earlier, is trying to feel certain states doesn't mean it makes it spiritual, because it has method. So my teacher would say that she was working on through her spiritual method, working on her cellular physical cells, and she would say, I would love to meet a biologist to talk about this, to see if science validates my experience. In the language in which, it's about these, I'll take an example in Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a beautiful example because, like we say, in India, people can be asked to, if you're not feeling well, or for anything that you're having, you can be asked to recite a mantra if you believe that that's going to help you. So, but then when you look at it, what happens is that now there's being research done around that. The Sanskrit language, why is it called scientific? Because the alphabet of the Sanskrit language is positioned in a way that is very logical. So how do you make a sound? What happens? How does the sound come? There is air and there is obstruction to that air and sound happens. And so how these sounds happen, the groups of, like in English, you say A, B, C, D, there is no logic to why B comes after A. But in Sanskrit, the first consonants, for example, are k, k, g, g, n. It's the farthest place in your mouth where the obstruction happens. And you can't make a sound with an obstruction in your mouth farther than that. Then the next set of consonants is ch, so it goes from the bottom of your palate to the tips until you do until that sound. And so it's a very logical organization. And when you recite mantras, what happens is that mantras are based on certain rhythm, okay, like poetry. You have meters. Meters are rhythm. And rhythm is based on the natural, they have names like the walk of the elephant or the movement of the snake. These are the words that are that represent those rhythms. And I'm sorry, I'm a bit long, but because it's like Chinese, so I have to go into some explanation for.
Yeah.
And but then it's not just enough to say the movement of the serpent. How does a serpent move? There is observation in it. And you ask anybody, okay, the serpent zigzags. But if the serpent was only zigzagging, would it be moving forward? So there is a movement to the left, then there is a movement to the center, then there is an observation of the movement. And time is very important. How long you do what, and that rhythm, that time is translated into a rhythm. And when you practice that rhythm, you have to modulate your breath in a certain way. And science today speaks about breath being able to modulate your metabolism. We have pranayama. What is pranayama? Is regulation of the breath. You can do things with your breath which can increase your energy. You can do things with your breath which can make you slower, etc. So, and that is how reciting something has an impact, because all these things are involved. There is a school now that is helping like you said, to be precise, when somebody has speech deficiencies, stammering or not being able to say certain sounds. Now, if it is something of physical deformation, it's different. And so they're just reciting the Sanskrit alphabet does the gymnastic and heals speech deficiencies, because there is a logic to it. So, and yeah, so there was.
So the mantras then.
I don't know, this is how I bifurcate and go into something and.
So I'm just, that's very interesting. So just briefly, so the mantras then are not just some random sort of feel good, inspirational quote to make you feel good. No, there's a physical component to it.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Great. There was a comment here, Maria Fabregas, who volunteered, Gordon, said that she wants to add something. So how about if we hear from Maria, and then we'll move on to my next question. Go ahead,
I'll try to keep quiet now with all I've heard. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak.
Sure.
I'm a scientist.
Okay.
That's what I do for a living.
Great.
And I'm also, I consider myself a spiritual person, or I work a lot on my growth, influenced by Buddhism. And I do think that a good scientist, I think, Mario, you commented before that scientists, actually, bad scientists will say, you know, this has been scientifically proven.
Right.
Good scientist, to be a good scientist, you need to be very, very humble. Mm-hmm. Because the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, the more complex it gets, the more beyond your scope it gets, to a point where, yeah, I mean, even the things that you know, you don't really know. Complex is where I'm a biologist, or actually behavioral ecologist. Things are much more complex than that. That's on one side. And on the other side, I was going to say that I think both of them can merge very nicely. On one side, because of that curiosity of the scientists, always but why, and trying to understand. And the other part would be that science must be non-judgmental. So even if you're after a result, even if this is my hypothesis and I really want to prove this, sometimes you find that actually you don't. Even things that you were certain, you know, because you've seen it, well, no. And then once you run your experiment, then you realize that you were wrong. Right. So you need to be not judgmental. Whatever it is. You know, if it's positive, it's positive. So if you know, if you get a significant result, it's significant. And if not, then it's not. And then that might have to change many other things, because as you said, theories and hypotheses are to be disproved. That's what they're up there. This is true until something proves it's not.
Right.
So it also has that aspect of wonder, like, wow, and then you're never gonna get to know everything at all in any topic. So yes, I think both of them have similarities.
Yeah.
And as Vibha was explaining, there's a lot of observation behind both of them, behind the mantras. This is not something that, you know, someone thought, no, this is years and years and thousands of years of, when you do this, this happens. When you do this doesn't happen. It's this voice, it's this sound, it's the, yeah. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Maria. That's really wonderful. I appreciate that. There's a great, you made me think of this great YouTube video of Richard Feynman, the physicist, talking about a rose. And he's talking about how, you know, a poet friend of his said, oh, you scientists can never really appreciate a rose because you don't have the emotional depth and all of that. And he said, you know, that's just ridiculous, right? I mean, I can have the same emotional experience of it that you can, but I can also understand the science about it, right? And I can understand why it's this color and why, you know, bees come to it and all these sort of things. So these two things complement each other, right? And for me, the best scientists do have this curiosity that you're talking about, and this open-minded humility, and that we could call spiritual. And the best spiritual teachers have the same kind of humility and appreciation for science, and an understanding that this is a question we answer through science, and this is a question we answer in some other way, right? And we're richer, you know, for having both of those, but we make a mistake to conflate them, right? For example, I hear people talk, you know, misusing quantum physics all the time. Oh, quantum physics proves this or proves that. And, well, no, it doesn't, right? And, you know, so we've got to, you know, we can't distort science when we want to, and we can't dismiss subjective experience at the same time, I think. All right. Well, thank you for that, Maria. Appreciate that. So Vibha, one of the things I wanted us to talk about is what kind of drew you to the awareness to action work, you know, the work that we were doing. And if you don't mind sharing your story there with us.
Yes. So, well, if you remember where we met Mario, it was in the Paris conference, IEA conference. Yes. And
with
so,
the zombies, that's it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so I was, and you were the EndNote speaker.
Uh-huh.
And I think this was your subject.
I may have been.
Yes. And so people had, told me about you, and so I kind of was geared up, if Mario says anything against spirituality, I'm going to speak up, And so, and then as I listened to you, like you spoke about the rose, saying that you'll never get to feel the beauty of the rose or whatever, that kind of subjective experience. So for me, listening to you, I was just struck, first of all, by the clarity and the unambiguous way you used words. And so for me, that I can't say it was a rational choice, to please you, I said, hey, something there resonates for me, this logic is beautiful. I don't know if we can say that, but it's like, when you are in presence of beautiful music, it does something to you. When you're in presence with intelligence, you start feeling more intelligent as well, because it triggers your own intelligence. It's just that. So I started having all kinds of, connections and thoughts, and oh yes, the Enneagram can be seen like this and that. And then you came for the certification program in Paris, and I was hesitating, it was more like an inspiration for me, but then I made up my mind and I just went. And when I saw your approach, the first words that struck me were, you spoke about your famous quotation, all models are
wrong,
erroneous. Yes,
yeah,
wrong in a sense.
Yeah.
So yes, that's right. And and then you said that the Enneagram is value neutral. And that is something I try to remember every day, that because it kind of actually, I had gone, because of my, the way I was brought up and the way I had to believe that something had spiritual value to be able to even use it practically. And, but it didn't sound nice. It made sense to me inside, but when I spoke about it, the words wouldn't come right. I knew that, because I was struggling with that. How do I see how useful it's been to me, and for me on my inner work, and I see how it could help so many people, but I don't know how to speak about it to everybody. And I remember one of the picture, I have to kind of explain everything to my brain to accept it. So it was like the sun. The sun is just shining and doing its thing in the physical world. And some, look at it and pray, like in India, and sunset and sunrise are special moments, and they connect to it. And it can even represent the divine to them. But then in a physics class, if they're talking about the sun, they won't say that the sun is the divine. And you see, it can mean different things, but when you're speaking, it again brings us to context. Who is our audience, and what is our topic here?
Right.
And so that making the Enneagram value neutral kind of saved me from turning it into another religion, in the sense that for me, religion is a path, like science can be a path, like music can be a path. In India, anything can be a path to the spiritual experience. So it is a path, but it isn't it. And for me, because of the importance the Enneagram was taking in my life, I was, you know, slipping into that mistake of the word I would put is, you know, a kind of fervor that comes into you when you want to convert everybody, and you know, that kind of. So that was really, really important for me, the value neutral, and the fact that it's behavior focus, because my background is in education, and education is, I won't go into that, it'll go. So anyway, so it's behavior focused, and it's not that because I'm doing this thing, I'm a bad person, or I need to even, you know, feel bad about it and stay in a bad state and all of that kind of thing. Behavior is something I observe that I'm doing, and something I can change, and it has a different impact, and it's experiment and try and all of that. But that behavior is not just haphazard, it's based on self-awareness and the whole process, self-awareness, authenticity, not lying to oneself. Not lying to oneself is crucial in spirituality as well.
No.
And so there is this, and what I also liked as a teacher is everything you, in the awareness to action you were doing, you were able to explain why are you using action verbs, navigating, transmitting, preserving.
No.
And that's you. And so that was very important to me, because my first contact with industry, I mean, with the corporate world was in industry. I was teaching English, and like it could be for people who were working in international organizations, and they needed just 400 words to be functional, and it could be with a director who had a very important meeting and he had to be operational in English. So I used it in different levels, and so for me it was this thing, being able to apply my reason to the context in which I'm working, and the awareness to action process really helps me do that. And it's really simple to transfer.
Yeah.
So those are the reasons why, you know, I still am around.
Yeah, I vividly remember our first conversation in Paris, and you know, you saying something to the effect of, "I was prepared not to like you during this," and we've been friends ever since. I've got a lot of respect for someone who's willing to be that direct and you know, and honest. So so I'll comment on a couple of things there, right? So the value neutrality part of it is really important to me, right? I mean, it's funny, it brings to mind another Dalai Lama quote where some psychologist from the West was trying to explain the concept of flow to the Dalai Lama. And after listening for a while, the Dalai Lama said, you know, you people make this just way too difficult, right? If you want to be happy, start doing the things that are good for you and stop doing the things that are bad for you, right? And, you know, and so that's easy to say, and it's very sensible. And of course, it's really hard to figure out what are the things that are good for me or the things that are bad for me. But sometimes it helps to reduce something to its core, to, you know, because a lot of times we get way out here, right, in our thinking, and we get lost in the mess. And sometimes it's useful to just say, wait, bring it back to this, okay? How are you overdoing striving to be powerful? How are you overdoing striving to be peaceful, whatever the strategy is? And then from there, we can expand back out again, but in a more coherent and structured way, right? So for me, it's always, you know, I kind of irritate people when they become too simplistic. I tell them, well, it's more complicated than that, right? And then when they get really complicated, I say, look, let's just make this simple, right? But that needs to be a reminder that, you know, we need to, you know, recognize when we're going way out here or losing track of what's at the heart of it. Another thing I want to say, Vibha, and this is something that we've talked about, and maybe you have a comment on it. You know, I do have this reputation in the Enneagram world of being anti-spiritual, which is, you know, again, not accurate. I'm a former seminarian myself, and I'm not anti-spiritual at all. What I get frustrated by in the Enneagram world is a tendency to turn the Enneagram kind of into a religion, right? And to start treating it as if its own self-contained religion or something. And approaches that I've seen in that way just strike me as really uninteresting and unsophisticated, right? And for me, that's my frustration with a lot of what I see in the Enneagram world. It's just not interesting spirituality to me, right? As opposed to what you're talking about, right? Which is much more robust and in-depth. And so for me, the Enneagram is only a tool that can help us in our spiritual practice, but it shouldn't become that finger pointing to the moon, right? Where we get trapped on the finger and forget about the moon. So, all right. Vibha, we have about 10 minutes left, and there are also some questions. So there are a few things you wanted to say about Aurobindo's rules of education.
I don't think we will have time for that.
All right, good. It's great stuff, and you know, it's something we could, you know, devote another half hour to, but we are running out of time. So let's see, Maria Jose, are there questions there? I see some things in the chat room, but I can't see what they are.
So there are comments, but no, just people that unfortunately have had to leave, that say that they are sorry they have to leave because they're enjoying it. That the phonetics do sound Chinese, Clement Lowe commented. And no, there's nothing else.
Okay, all right. So, so Vibha, let's see here. I think that this will take us, well, I'll tell you what. Can we do these in 7 minutes or so?
Yes, let's do it quickly.
Let's do that. Okay, whoops, let's go to the first one. Can you see my screen there? See, we're going to talk about the 3 points on education by Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. So integral education is based on these 3 principles. And then, of course, there's the whole methodology of how you put it in the classroom. But I wanted to share this because this also is, like we mentioned, the value neutral approach. The teacher is not an instructor or taskmaster. He's a helper and a guide. And his business is to suggest and not to impose.
Yeah, great.
And so, which means that you when you suggest is you provide very little and you allow the person to work with that until he has other questions, and then he goes further. Instead of coming with a lot of information, like with applying this to the Enneagram, in that sense, if we come with a lot of information about type, and it can be, people can, you know, find themselves lost in all that information. So it's starting with simple and then allowing that to unfold.
Yeah, I like that. And when I teach the Enneagram in organizations, I always tell people, I'm not here. My job is not to help people become Enneagram experts, right? It's to give them some fundamental ideas that they can then extrapolate from, right? So I give you a piece of something, and then you figure out what to do with this. And you can always refer to the books. You can always, you know, get more knowledge. But you know, the instinctual biases, for example. Okay, if we understand that you and I are both navigating as our dominant bias, well, people can figure that out. Oh, well, what would it mean to be navigating, right? What would it mean to strive to feel peaceful? And so there's an element of self-education that happens.
Yes, yes.
Great. All right, so tell us about the second principle. Oops.
so yes, that was the second principle, is that the mind has to be consulted in its own growth. So to force the nature to abandon its own dharma is to do it permanent harm, mutilate its growth, and deface its perfection. So this is one thing that came to mind when you speak about the strategies, and you say, for me as a 9, if people start just telling me, express yourself and say what you think and don't care what others and all of that, it won't work for me.
Yeah.
So you can go back to the other slide,
Sure.
the previous one, just to give them a. So there is, because in Sanskrit we have a word called swadharma, and swa is own, and bhava is a way of being, a nature, a quality. And out of that, we have our inner way of being, and we have our quality. And out of that comes a conduct. Dharma is something that holds, that's something that binds you together. And so in India, like the potter has a dharma, the teacher has a dharma, because you're doing something in a certain context, having a certain nature. Mm-hmm. And so this, it clicked, because this was one of the things as well, is why what attracted me was it clicked, it fit with, the Indian way of seeing things as well in education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such an important concept to me. And one of the things my corporate clients always say is that when I approach the Enneagram in a value neutral way and don't tell them they have to become something else, they have to reject it, it feels more compassionate to people, right? Mm-hmm. And when they feel that compassion, that, hey, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you being a 9. Right. And then we say, oh, okay, well, that's a relief. Now I don't have to fight. I don't have to get defensive about it. And the only question is, am I striving to feel peaceful in an effective way or an ineffective way? And, you've got to pick a strategy, so you might as well stick with it, right? So, yeah, I like that. All right. And so the final principle here
is to work from the near to the far, from that which is to that which shall be.
Say more about that.
So working from the near to the far is really being in your reality of just right where you are. It's that reality check. Mm-hmm. And if we apply it to our identity and the growth of our identity and how we expand and all of that, it is today, if I define myself as so and so, I have to work with that. I can't tell that person, no, you are not that. This is not true. What you are is a soul. It doesn't really fit that way. And that which shall be is what the person aspires for. So of course there is something in the future that's calling us, but we can go there only if we take into full consideration what is here right now.
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate that a lot. All right. Well, we're out of time. Vibha, thank you so much for this conversation. I always enjoy talking with you, and I hope people enjoyed this conversation as well. Let's see. So we're going to end here now. My thanks to Vibha for being here.
Thank you, Mario.
Always a pleasure. And Maria Jose, thank you for your support. So we'll take a break here and start again in 10 minutes and with the next session, which will be Liz Cunha with Maria Jose. So thanks, everybody. Take a quick break. Everybody. We'll see you shortly. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.